And a number of people here, actually. Tarun Khanna, who will be joining us later on, is a professor at Harvard Business School and is currently the director of the South Asia Institute. He was actually our first keynote in our first year, which was very exciting. He will be back to close this conference with a panel this afternoon. And I invite you all to stay for that, as well as for a very brief reception afterwards, simply to make sure we have time to talk with friends and so on. We also have Mina Hewitt to thank, who is here at SAI, as well as Nora Majin. And SAI has been extraordinary in this. SAI has been with us from the start. They have not only provided this beautiful venue and a tremendous amount of logistical support, but also lunch, and it's a great lunch, and just a variety of other very supportive gestures for this group of teachers. Educators for Teaching India is really just a group of teachers. It's a group of teachers who got together 7-8 years ago. We were initially sponsored by a grant from the Abbott Academy Association at Phillips Academy, as well as from the Windsor School. And if I could ask anyone who is with EFTI to go ahead and stand, I'd love to introduce you. So we have Kristen Strobel from Lexington High School, up on the right. Brian Didier from the Windsor School. Let's see, Patricia.
I'm retired. I'm retired from the...
No, you're not. Patricia Lothrop from the St. George's School, and Amy Enright from Rivers, and there are several other folks out there. Tom Lemann from Groton. We have gotten financial support from Groton as well as St. George's, and thank you very much for that. And Indu Chugani, of course, who will not be able to be with us today, but will hopefully come in later today. Indu has a new job at Milton, and really wanted to come today, but had a major conflict that she was unable to avoid. I think what's most exciting about this conference for me is that as someone who teaches about India all the time, someone who dreams of actually introducing an enhanced course, and I'm looking at Mr. Huzio here, at Phillips Academy on Indian history and contemporary India, I just find the interaction with colleagues in this venue tremendously exciting and rewarding. We're very close friends. We are all full-time teachers. We do this by the seat of our pants, which is evident in different ways every year. So I'll just ask your indulgence about that this year and say we're going to keep trying to make things better. And thank you all very much for coming. What have I missed?
I think you're good.
I think I'm good.
Oh, logistics.
So, right, logistics of the day. So in the program, on the back of your program, you will see the locations for major talks. A couple of pages in from the back are specific rooms where the workshops will take place. We are approaching workshops this year in a slightly different manner. We have always focused on trying to deepen our own personal knowledge of India on whatever the topic is. And I think that's worked very well for all of us because many of us are teaching full-blown courses on India, and many of us are trying to work these concepts into a very demanding world history course, for example, or an English curriculum, or, as we've had in the past, math and art and the sciences. So we're all coming from different standpoints. This year, for the first time, we are actually going to welcome students who will be part of the presentation. Brian Didier has been working with kids at Windsor for many years, not only in India, but back here as well. And his students will be presenting some of their own research and work as a part of a broader workshop later this morning and this afternoon. This afternoon, I think, Brian. Yeah, thank you. So Raj is going to introduce our topic for today. But again, I just want to welcome everyone and make sure that we all have a chance to talk and welcome you back. It's just great to see so many folks who are now becoming very familiar and close friends.
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. My name is Raj Mundra, and along with Christopher, we teach at Phillips Academy in Andover. And I'd like to just share with you a couple of different things related to today's conference. First, the motivation for this topic. the planning committee actually had a healthy debate about whether the focus for this conference should be gender or should be women. And ultimately, we chose to focus on the roles of girls and women in India, and we wanted to bring specific attention to women. We don't believe this focus to be narrow, and we trust we could spend a semester together and still only start to understand the different perspectives. My mother and my wife grew up in India, and I saw firsthand how their experiences were very different than my father's and my brother-in-law's. Now, my mother and my wife both note how my niece's experiences in modern India are so different from their time growing up. And, I wonder if we held this conference 50 years ago, 25 years ago, how similar and how different the issues would be. I travel with faculty and students to India every summer, and our focus has been to work with organizations involved in community development. It's so clear to me that in any development project that we learn about, that women's issues, women's leadership are central to how India is going to develop community by community and really as a nation. And when students start to understand issues through a woman's perspective, it often changes the narrative that we often hear in the news or in our textbooks. Both Christopher and I are not Indian women. Hope that is obvious. However, we have spent a lot of time in India. Christopher teaches economics. I teach a global sanitation course at Andover. And learning about women in India is central to how we approach our teaching in those courses. For both of us, one of the most compelling pieces of information that we discuss with our students is how maternal education is the most important explanatory variable for poverty alleviation. And that comes up for us over and over and over again. We feel fortunate to have this opportunity to learn more, to connect, to share with our students the varied perspectives and forces involved in understanding how Indian women are negotiating tradition and modernity today. As teams of educators designed the workshops this year, our fantastic presenters worked to contextualize their knowledge for our audience. And they asked the following questions. What are the frameworks, what are the schema that are helpful to deepen our understanding of the topic? How to discuss these issues in our classes? What resources are available for us? The goals for the day, as Christopher noted, we are coming from this from many different angles. We hope that today, though, is an opportunity to learn more about concepts, network with people also interested in teaching and learning about India, connect and build on what you already do in your classroom, and to maybe spark new ideas. Thank you for taking the time from your schedule to be with us today. I would say embrace the complexity of all the different ideas, and sometimes I feel like the messiness. Ask questions, meet somebody new, engage in dialogue, eat well at lunch. And we're very, very excited you're here. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy Enright from the River School, a history teacher there, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. So, Amy.
Thank you so much, Raj. It's a real pleasure to see everyone here today. Dr. Harleen Singh may need no introduction to those of you who teach world history or world literature in the New England area. Through her work with us here at EFTI, some of you may remember her last year giving a wonderful workshop on women and Indian democracy, and her work with Primary Source, where she's given workshops on film. She's clearly committed to bringing scholarship on Indian experience, particularly Indian women's experience, into secondary and middle school classrooms, which is wonderful, and we are profoundly grateful for that connection to help us serve our students better and to feel more confident as we make the decisions on what to present to them. Her own scholarship began with master's and doctoral work at the University of California, San Diego. She is currently Associate Professor of Literature, Women and Gender Studies, and South Asian Studies at Brandeis, and the Faculty Director of the India Initiative. She offers courses on comparative literature, feminist theory, and South Asian studies. And I'm happy to say that we do have an opportunity to learn about her most recent book, which is called The Public Life of Rani Lakshmi Bai, Gender, Nation, History, and Fable. It's at the printers now, but we have posters in the back and also a way to sign up and order it for those of you who are interested. So be sure to check that out at some point today in the lobby. But for now, it is our great privilege to welcome and to be taught by Dr. Harleen Singh.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that very warm welcome this morning. Good morning, everyone, and may I say, welcome to spring. I've needed to say this. I am not, as you know, I did my doctoral work in San Diego, and I think it's a cruel joke to have to do your PhD in Southern California and then come to work in New England after that. So I'd like to thank the educators for teaching India and the South Asia Initiative at Harvard for inviting me here today. As Raj clearly pointed out, he's not an Indian woman, and you will be able to tell that I very much am. So it is a conversation for me which works really at many different levels. It is a conversation about the political, the social, even the historical trajectory of women in India. But it is also in many ways a personal story. And I think that there is real value in the personal foregrounding the political in this venue precisely. The other thing that Raj mentioned also is this question about the very different ends of the spectrum at which women find themselves in India, especially in modern India. And I'm going to try to touch on that a little bit today, talking about culture, popular culture, talking about some recent trajectories of history and so forth. I also realize that your program has a very extensive and well-placed selection of panels. So part of my challenge for today was to try to say something that wouldn't either steal the thunder from the panels or be, just be repetitive in some way. So bear with me as I try. Now, a series of workshops will follow my talk, and as I said, they address a wide range of subjects: women in the public sphere, violence, female feticide, Hinduism, and women in power. So I asked myself, what can you add? A few stories, perhaps. I am foremost a student of literature, and my topic today is women in India between tradition and modernity. Thus, you'll find history, sociology, anthropology, ethnography, literary study, even musicology, no science, and perhaps, though we could get there, and perhaps even some philosophy in these stories, and maybe together we can piece a narrative of sorts. Story number 1. My grandmother, my father's mother. Her name was Prakash Kaur. She was born and brought up in Burma, the daughter of Indian railway workers. In 1942, during World War II, when Japanese forces attacked Burma, she walked along with other Indians. The trains, boats, and planes were commandeered by the Europeans to India. She walked for 4 months. She was 3 months pregnant when she started. 7 months pregnant when she finished the walk. And the child came early. They didn't expect him to survive. He is my father. She had 8 children, 5 of which survived, 2 sons and 3 daughters. All 3 daughters became doctors and married doctors. One son retired at the rank of a 3-star general. Another became an aeronautical engineer. Her husband had died when her eldest child was 21. She educated and brought up all the children on her own. Strength and success so far. Her husband had left her a house that she sold to pay for her children's education. As her children went to form families of their own, she moved between homes and was the doting grandmother. However, she always expected to live with her eldest son and die in his home. But his wife would not have it that way. My grandmother died in one of her daughter's home, not an ignoble end by any means, but it was not what she wanted. That was not how she wanted to go. Why do I tell the story? It is not simply to have the personal foreground the political, but to show instead that an intricate network of governance, societal norms, economic independence, and maternity are at work even in this small story. Surely, my grandmother should be celebrated for the immense strength she displayed as a woman in her life. She should be remembered for her commitment as a mother. She's a testament to the ways in which a displaced refugee created successful lives for her children. I remember her, however, as a woman without a home she could call her own. A woman who could not even die in a place of her choosing. Story number 2. My grandmother, my mother's mother. Her name was Sharda Bhardwaj. She came from incredible privilege. Her father was the royal priest of a kingdom in the Himalayas. She belonged to the highest echelon of the Brahmin society in India. She was the first woman to be educated in that area. She would travel by foot, then horse, then train for 3 days to get to her school and eventually her college. On one of those journeys, a young man, an Indian officer in the British Army, saw her, proposed, and she accepted. You educate women and they start making their own choices. It's one of the pitfalls. Her father was not happy. She was in love, however, and she married and left with that young man. As you can tell, I come from a long line of rebellion. That marriage, however, fell apart as India gained independence. The British Army was disbanded, and her husband found himself at odds with the new structure. He took to drinking, gambling, and everything else that follows. My grandmother took a job as a school teacher and focused on educating her 5 children. One of those was my mother. My mother left school early to work because she saw that there were 4 other children who had to be fed, and she started working to feed her younger siblings. The children all eventually left, and my grandmother continued to work as a teacher of Sanskrit literature at Sophia Convent College in Mount Abu, Rajasthan. When she retired, she came to live with her 2 sons. Eventually, she flitted between the 2 as neither couple wanted to keep her for too long. She died where she least expected to live, in a home that was alien to her. Both these stories contain within them a strident engagement with patriarchy. Both grandmothers fought the system, yet, in simple ways, it was rigged against them in ways they could not have anticipated. Apotheosized as mothers, grandmothers, yet they never became landholders, owners, women of means. I say this to drive home the point that the traditional space of femininity in India, especially in the domestic categories, has an elevated narrative, but a far more sobering social reality. Even as culture places value in the figure of the mother, the wife, or the grandmother, they are seldom those who can control value in terms of money, property, and means, or their own lives for that matter. Thus, the traditional space of women is celebrated, but the modern space of woman as citizen remains compromised. And this is really where the talk begins. Mother India. I have up here an image about the quintessential, goddess figure of Mother India. The idea of India as an embodiment of strength, Bharat Mata. Mother India has an interesting history that derives from religious constructs of the earth as goddess, but really takes on political overtones in the encounter with European colonialism and its influence on Indian masculinity. It is a conversation about women in India, but as you know, anybody who works on gender, that you can't really talk about women in India without also talking about men in India and talking about the constructs of gender in India. And I'm actually glad that it was named Women in India, because I'm one of those who's resisting the change from women's studies programs to women's studies and gender studies as well, because not that I don't think that these need to be inclusive categories, but really to hold on to the fact that there is a lot yet that needs to be accomplished with women's studies, and that there's a great political investment in that term as well. So I'm actually very glad that it was Women in India. So getting back to Mother India, the emergence then of the Indian male nationalist, the Indian male leaders, was paralleled by a growing rhetoric in which Mother India was no longer simply the giver of strength, but rather a weakened woman in need of virile energy and protection. It is one of India's enduring contradictions that the country that is known as Mother India has Gandhi, who is known as father of the nation. So it's a very clear, even in this very simple example, there's a very clear dichotomy between what tradition and modernity entails. So whereas the traditional construct of India, the land as mother, the land as goddess, is always feminine embodiment, Mother India, Bharat Mata, yet the nation as a modern construct is really a gift of the father of the nation, right? He is the one who really engenders a particular modern identity for India. Masculine control then is reasserted at the very moment in which it is most threatened. Sorry, our PowerPoint crashed somehow today, and I'm moving between two screens. So here we go. Released in 1957, the film Mother India featured a well-known actress, Nargis, in the role of a poor peasant who is abandoned by her husband and has to fend for herself and her sons. You see why I started with my grandmothers. The figure conflated the idea of the country struggling to fulfill its destiny as a modern nation with the figure of the peasant woman. India was this woman, and this woman was India. In the earlier, more ideological phase in Indian culture, the harsh realities of independence and the brutal memories of partition were tempered by the euphoria of modern citizenship. So we went through all of that, but now we have citizenship. We're independent. We are a new nation. India was free. The British were gone. So now we had no one to blame but ourselves. And the task of nation building in many ways depended on the populace, but also on a particularly gendered category of citizenship. Even though women had been central to the nationalist movement, Gandhi going so far as to say that India will never be free until its women are free. But he also stressed that women should be a part of the non-violence movement in India, because who else could teach the world better about passive suffering? Women at this early stage of nation building were a category that had been brought into play by the British, accusing Indian society of widow burning, female infanticide, and more. Indian nationalists responded by putting women in a unique modern identity where they were touted as the ideal combination of Indian values and modern outlook. These and other issues relating to colonialism and Indian nationalism have been attentively researched, and there is much feminist scholarship on it. So I encourage you to look up any of these terms. I do think that the history of women in India as it pertains to the history of Indian nationalism is especially important to understanding anything about gender as it functions as a modern category. Because it is during the nationalist movement that the idea of the male nationalist as a particularly, kinetic, volatile figure emerges alongside this notion of the woman as a passive sufferer, the reservoir of strength, but really quiet strength, not loud. All of these things are really a part of this colonial encounter. So we may trace many of these archetypes to Hinduism, to the goddess imagery, etc. But the modern identity of these constructs in many ways has everything to do with the colonial encounter and then nationalism that followed afterwards. So I'm going to move on now to a few topics. As I said before, I really structured this in a way to have a more general talk that in somehow places or raises questions about this idea of tradition and modernity, which is, as you know, you'll be able to discuss and deepen further in your panels. And of course, there's some small time after this for questions. So please use me standing here and ask any questions that you want to afterwards. Women as leaders. I will not go into this in much detail as there is a panel dedicated to this, but I did want to show this image of Indira Gandhi that is once again superimposed on the map of India. This is a figure of her at the time of her assassination. So I want to show you once again the ways in which this figure has moved through history from that original idea of the mother of India and Mother India as the goddess figure to actually Indira Gandhi, the first Prime Minister of India, in that same imagery in many ways. I do want to show this image of a dying Indira Gandhi that is once again superimposed on the map of India. Even though women have been in positions of power since the founding of the Indian nationalist movement in the 19th century, a majority of these positions have been inherited through patriarchal connections. Indira Gandhi was the daughter of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the dynastic trend continues in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, where daughters or wives of former heads of states have reigned as leaders. Women's issues. I want to move now to address some key junctures of women's lives that are an issue in India and abroad, albeit with immense difference. 1. In the United States, voting rights starts at the forefront of the feminist movement. If you follow the waves in any way, many people talk about the suffragist movement and the movement against the abolition, the movement for the abolition of slavery as really the starting point of the modern feminist movement. It's interesting to note, of course, that India had voting rights from women from the inception of independence. So as a modern category, women have always had all rights and privileges, right? It's the translation of that into social reality which makes it very different. Abortion. It is legal in India. However, male preference has led to an inordinate number of female fetuses being aborted. And this moves to Amartya Sen's assertion about 1 million women missing. Again, I think there's a panel on that as well. Marriage and divorce. Separate civil codes exist for communities covered under the Hindu Marriage Act and for Muslims under the Muslim Civil Code. So, for instance, there isn't a national civil code. So if you are married, you either fall under the marriage, the Hindu Marriage Act, the Muslim Marriage Act, and now there is a separate section also for Christians. But you understand that there are many different communities in India, including Jewish, Sikh, Buddhist, Jains, and many more, who don't really fit into any of these categories. So that these large structures of what a Hindu marriage is supposed to look like and what a Muslim marriage is supposed to look like govern many of the marriage and divorce proceedings for people. Education. India continues to have a robust representation of women in higher education. However, literacy rates for women remain abysmally low. And it is this contradiction. You'll see women in higher education in many ways, far more than men sometimes. And of course, the STEM fields in this country, we've been encouraging women to get into the STEM fields. But in India, women have been in the STEM fields in a large number, right? However, that doesn't translate into a basic literacy rate for women around the country. Women in the workforce. Women have, of course, worked alongside their men in farming and many other non-formal sectors that do not always result in what I call transactional exchange. So for this instance, when people are celebrating women in the workforce, I will say women have been working from the dawn of time, right? It's just that it hasn't been transactional. It doesn't have value to it that can be really gauged in terms of profit, loss, and transaction. But women are now in the workforce in more prominent ways than before in all fields in India. Violence against women. Again, there is a panel on this, and I do not wish to steal anybody's thunder, but I do want to propose here that violence be understood not simply as a throwback to the traditional, but rather as a new articulation of the modern moment, as a new articulation of the pressures of modernity. All these issues are at the forefront of women's activism in India, and it is important to note here that feminist movement in India has a long history, also complicated by its colonial antecedents, but a long history nevertheless. This is one of those things that really raises my hackles when there are conversations outside of India, and there's no other way to say this, I'm just going to say it as bluntly as possible. Conversations in the Western world, so to speak, the United States, Europe, about women's lot in India and what should be done to improve it. And I think it's great that we're engaging. We're no longer, in the isolated stand, and it's great that we're engaging. But I think it's important to realize that India, South Asia, all of these countries have a long history of a feminist tradition, which is indigenous. There have been feminist movements in these countries that have been actually very effective in putting laws on paper. As far as the Constitution is concerned, there may be no other country in the world that has such strong protections for women as India does. The problem is the movement from law as a legal construct to social reality. So I was just teaching a class yesterday, and people were talking about violence in India, and I pointed out to them that, well, actually, and I steer you to another article by Amartya Sen, which just came out a couple of years ago in the New York Review of Books, where he talks about reassessing his earlier writings on women in India. And Sen puts together this amazing statistical analysis of violence against women, and actually India figures very low compared to what its population is, right? It has these sensational cases, but actually India figures very low. And in fact, the rates for violence against women in the United States and even in Europe are much higher. The difficulty, however, now, before we start rah-rah about, how safe India is for women, it's important to realize that the difference is not that women will not be assaulted in the US and not in India, but that the legal recourse after such assault or the legal prevention before such assault takes completely different, visages, just completely different face here. And I think that's what's important to understand. This is why I'm really focusing on trying to complicate this. So it's not a clear-cut notion of traditional culture, modern culture, this happens in traditional culture. And especially when it comes to women, right? India has been indicted many times over for what are called the crimes of culture. Right? That these are not crimes committed by individual, but rather crimes that are actually fostered, encouraged, and somehow tolerated by an entire culture. And I think it's important to understand then that culture is no longer a static entity, which is simply historical, traditional, cultural, religious, conservative, but rather actually an engagement with new modern trajectories that create this exciting and complex moment. So I want to, again, move us to two different moments just to give you some sense of the feminist movement. This one I really, really like. The Chipko movement. On March 26, 1974, a group of women formed protective cordons around trees. They hugged them. They hugged them to save them from being cut. These were peasant women whose livelihood depended on the forest, They were not organized protesters by any means, but they became a clarion call for ecological conservation, and they gave rise to the term we all know so well, tree hugger. So when you see that term, and think about women in India, that term actually goes all the way back to the 70s and came from the Chipko movement in India, which was started by women who had no other means to save these trees from being cut, but to form protective cordons around them and hug them. In December 2012, the Delhi rape case that, I'm quoting now from the Supreme Court judgment, that shocked the collective conscience of India, galvanized men and women across the country to protest violence against women, and it resulted in the most extensive overhaul of laws with regard to rape, domestic abuse, sexual harassment, and more. So where does this leave us? Educationally speaking, research on women's lives has been undertaken by scholars of literature, historians, sociologists, economists, and more. Nothing I am saying is particularly new today. What is new, however, is the persistence of discrimination and the new forms it has taken with modernity. For example, the advance in ultrasound technology led to healthier babies. We're talking about maternal health. But it also led, of course, to more male babies, because it made it very easier. It is now illegal in India actually to know the sex of your child. So it was a great moment for us. I got pregnant when I was in India, and I was 6 months pregnant there, and you're not supposed to know legally who or what you're carrying. And when I came to the United States, I had to constantly tell the techs, like, don't tell me. Don't tell me. And it was a great moment for me, because in many ways, whereas in India, people were so careful to give no hint, to give no sense of what the child is, in the United States, everybody was jumping to share that news, to say, oh, it's a great baby, it's a beautiful baby, so on and so forth. And initially, I was thinking about it and said, come on. I mean, they should be able to tell me. I mean, really, do they really think this is what's going to happen? Till, my child was born here, and she's my daughter. And I realized then that, well, maybe I understand now why the doctors in India were being so careful to not say anything about this, right? Because it really, for them, fall under both legal protections and also a kind of cultural commitment to women. So what is unique about women's lives in India today is not that they are traditional, but that they exhibit a radical engagement with both tradition and modernity. I want to move us now to popular culture. Miss America 2013. Nina Davaluri was subject to racist comments in the United States when she won, people talking about what was American culture coming to, immigrants are now the face of the nation. I say this, of course, completely with irony. However, what is more perplexing to me is the reaction that she invoked in India, where commentators remarked on her dark skin, telling anyone who would listen that Nina had little chance of becoming Miss India with her dusky complexion. So of course it was all right for this dark woman to become Miss America, because it was a statement of inclusivity in this new wonderful modern nation. But in India, Nina Davaluri had little chance of becoming Miss India, where most Miss Indias, if you do a search for them, tend to have what I like to call unnaturally bright skin. The Fair and Lovely brand of cosmetics. So there's a brand of cosmetics called Fair and Lovely. The Fair and Lovely brand of cosmetics has had a long run in India, advertising the magical properties of its concoctions. So we're going to play now a little clip here. Oh, 1 second, sorry, it's not moving there. 1 second, I'm going to move this out. Yes, please. Well, at least the music was nice. All right. Start. All right. So this is Fair and Lovely has been in India for a long, long time. And as you noticed, maybe, I hope it was clear enough from the advertisement, you know, the woman who starts off as a kind of tomboyish character, right? She's the commentator for the cricket match. Note, of course, she's not playing in the cricket match. She's the commentator for the cricket match. She's sitting outside. She's dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, you know, unremarkable in most ways, till somebody hands her the Fair and Lovely Secret to Life. And she starts using it, and suddenly an audition tape goes out, and now she is not only, you know, she's not playing at being commentator, but in fact, she becomes the commentator, and her complexion brightens slowly and steadily to the point at which she can be in front of the camera rather than behind the camera. So one would think it couldn't get any more insidious. However, and I warn you that this is disturbing than most. If you notice, this Fair and Lovely now has a wash. Oh, I'm just going to put, come on, where are you? That now promises to brighten up your vaginal area, right? That fairness, which had so far been this idea of your complexion, your face, etc., has taken on, in the last few years, a completely different visage, where now you have actually these are not ads that I've picked up from secret channels. These appear on Indian television, right? These are advertisements that appear on Indian television. And when the makers were asked about this, they said, well, we are simply responding to what the modern woman wants. Women no longer want to be closeted, so to speak, about themselves and their sexuality, and we are responding to what the modern woman wants in India. So they completely framed their response and their product as a modern product that is the want of the consumer. Of course, signaling, of course, both the new arrival of the Indian woman as a consumer with economic clout, right? The Indian woman as a important populace to whom they must advertise, and one that is able to somehow demand for a product, and we have a product that's been created. Now, I play this, and I understand you probably may not be able to use this in your classes, but I play this for this audience because to me, it's absurd, it's satirical, it's hilarious, but it is a rather disturbing aspect of what it means now to be in control of your sexuality in India, right? So I'm trying to complicate these notions of what we consider feminist milestones or forefronts in the world, to talk about how this really insidious nexus of tradition and modernity, demands that we refract these categories through a different prism. Right? So here, being modern, being able to demand what you want sexually and to be a sexually assertive woman takes on a particular cultural framework. Okay, we're going to no more of that. Okay, we can come back to that because I'm going to do more with there. I want to reiterate here that globalization, modernization, technological advancement, things we usually measure on a linear progressive scale, are not necessarily the vehicles for empowerment in India. Thus, it makes us reconsider how the combined trajectories of education, economic independence are to effect change for women in an environment in which they become the very means of depriving women of liberty. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying for an instance that India does not need education, or that education or educational will not improve women's lives. I'm saying that the ways in which modernity's forces often intersect with conservative values in India is creating another subclass in India's present. To be very clear, this subclass that I'm referring to does not cut horizontally across society. Caste, class, region, religion, language even, have much to do with where women find themselves. Since 9/11, questions of Islam and of Muslim women are at the forefront of cultural inquiry. I'm asked many times what I think of the veil. I say that I remain suspicious of men covering up women, but I also remain suspicious of men uncovering women. As multinational clothing and cosmetic companies entered the Indian marketplace as a result of economic liberalization in 1991, India had a spate of winners at the Miss World and Miss Universe contest pageants. Was it simply coincidence that 4 Indian women won the Miss World contest between 1991 and 2000? At the same time at which L'Oreal and other big multinational cosmetic companies entered the Indian market for the first time? For all its history, the Miss World contest from 1994 to 2000, there were 4 Miss World who came from India. So I don't think really that's much of a coincidence, because I'm not sure Indian women were not beautiful before that, or they were not savvy enough to compete in there. Maybe there is another network of things here, but somehow this economic connection for me is very strong. So now we must have some amusement. And for this, I'm going to turn to a song from an Indian film. I hope you will enjoy this. So this is a wondrous song, combining English and Hindi in hybrid lyrics that oscillate between Sheila's ownership of her body and yet an acknowledgement that everybody wants it, but she owns it, right? I'm too sexy for you, right? And then the lyrics in Hindi say basically, you're not going to be able to catch me. Right? This is a body that Sheila owns in this video, right? In this song from a Hindi film. Yet, it is a body that Sheila must put on display in order to exert power over it and to exact power from it. It is once again an interplay between the private and public categories of women's bodies and their sexuality. I can, of course, go on and on with more film examples, but I'll leave that for more discussion. I'm going to finish now by returning and exiting. Please close tabs. Okay. I finish now by returning once again to stories. I'm the eldest child of my family. My father and his mother, my grandmother, brought me up. My mother died when I was quite young. I was encouraged to excel at sports. An avid reader, my father kept me supplied with comics and books. He encouraged me to play soccer for my state team. I swam for my school, college, and state. By all accounts, I had a privileged life that fostered my strengths and allowed me a certain amount of prominence until I reached puberty. I saw no difference between my brother and I. We were both treated the same by my father, but not so by my grandmother. Same grandmother. My brother was always given the choicest morsels at the table, bought the first presents, and always sued first, and even in fights that he'd started. And so, I began to think of my grandmother as the perpetrator of the injustice, and my father as the fountainhead of this liberal progressive mode of being modern in India. I was a child. And yet, I know today that my grandmother was internalizing a patriarchy that would only allow her power as a derivative of male relations. My father's mother, my brother's grandmother. My father's early liberal views, allowing me to wear shorts to play soccer, gave way as I grew older. I was encouraged to wear swimsuits that covered more, asked to look into the kitchen, and sternly forbidden from talking to the same boys with whom I had played soccer my whole life. In some ways, this story is not just India's. I imagine the general parameters would be the same even if we shifted it to the United States. However, there is a national and cultural identity that cannot simply be wished away. Whatever I may do, whoever I may become, I will always be an Indian woman. It is a racial, cultural, and national category. It is also a history, a politics, a philosophy, and a way of being. Poised between tradition and modernity is a story of India. It is my story. Thank you.
So I was just noting to our closing speaker that he was our keynote speaker at our first conference 6 years ago, and how this conference, for people who have come multiple times, has shifted and changed and enriched, really, a lot of our personal lives as well as how we approach teaching in our classrooms. So it is a pleasure that Tarun Khanna is back here, this time as director of the South Asia Institute, also a professor at the Harvard Business School, and also, I think not insignificantly, a parent of kids who are also grappling with India and how to understand India and the complexity of India. And so we've asked Tarun to share some of his insights about women in India from a different vantage point than maybe what we have heard today, or to try to pull together some of the themes that we have today, especially moving forward. So it's my pleasure to have Tarun Khanna give the closing remarks. Thank you.
It's a dramatic overstatement to say that I have great insights on the role of women in India, but I'm happy to share some reflections. Thank you, Raj, and thank you everybody for participating in this. And as primarily a parent, it's a delight to see you engaging with this, and I see a lot of familiar faces, including some of my kids' teachers. So it's always nice to see you. I'm sorry also that I couldn't participate in any of this. One of the pleasures of being at an institute like this is there's so many things going on and one of the costs of being an institute like this is that there's so many things going on. And I've been shuttling from one event to another. But I was handed by good friends some summary notes on what happened today, so I'll try to connect to some of these issues. I thought I was typing some comments a few minutes before I came here. I don't want to pretend I over-prepared, but I titled the comments Hope, Despair, and Reinvention in some sense, because I thought that to me allowed me to link to some of my own work, as well as connect to what I perceive to be some of the themes that you had spoken about earlier today. So I'll organize my comments in that bucket, except I'll start with despair because I don't want to end with despair. I want to start with despair and end with hope because that's how I feel. So on the despair side, lots of important-looking women up here, and that really signifies the hope side of things, that you do find women in positions of authority, women who have achieved things. Not all of them have been, not all of them are to the manner born silver spoon in their mouth. They've actually built themselves up, and that I suppose is the hope story. But on the despair side, I draw a parallel between women and other groups of people in many developing countries, and India is an exemplar. One of the good things about studying India is that you can see mirror images of many other societies in it if you look for it, and I suppose I'm predisposed to look for it. But one of the issues is that if you look for groups of people, demographic groups of people that have not been allowed to live out their potential in a variety of different ways, that framing allows me to draw a parallel between why I am sometimes despairing of the role of women in India. And I'm particularly thinking of India, of course, has a very complicated social structure, but one that's been extremely resilient. At a fairly abstract level, it has not changed much over centuries. I'm referring to the caste system and the social ordering and the endless debates about this for literally decades and centuries. But in a recent piece of work that I did with some political scientists and economic historians at Harvard and Brown, I was interested in understanding how political power and economic power has diffused to historically marginalized communities. And that's the point that I want to make, because it's some interesting analysis looking at it over several decades. So one would hope that in a democracy, and we're just about to experience the most raucous democratic experiment unfolding starting Monday, April 7th, for 6 or 7 weeks, as India goes into its electoral fiesta. One would hope that in a place where democracy is sort of alive and well, at least democracy is proxied by the existence of elections, that somehow political power and economic power would devolve to all sorts of groups of people, and certainly a group that accounts for 50% of the population, give or take, should claim their fair share of power. Well, my despair comes from the observation that that doesn't really seem to happen, at least not in economic terms. So Indra Nui and a couple of exceptions notwithstanding, and a lot of Indian origin women in my classes at Harvard notwithstanding, who are plenty vibrant and accomplished and raucous and what have you, as much so as the next person, that by and large, economic power has not meandered beyond a very select few in India. And that applies for the social communities, socially backward communities, the different ways of measuring. There's lots of measurement controversies, but by and large, it's hard to see economic power having devolved to remotely the extent that you would have liked to see it devolve. Interestingly, political power has devolved. Political power has devolved to historically marginalized social communities, but it has not been accompanied by economic power. And I don't know that I can formally say in a statistical sense that the same is true for groups of women as a community, but certainly when you proxy historically marginalized communities, as a generalization, I would offer that the dissemination of power in political terms has been far more satisfying to these marginalized communities than the dissemination of power in economic terms. And that gives me a lot of despair because economic power does translate into other forms of influence in setting the tone and debate and so on. And for those of you, so most of my scholarly work is really on economic empowerment in developing countries. And for the last 10 years, the empirical manifestation of this work has been in India and in rural China for the most part. And so I end up gravitating to compare China almost inevitably as a foil with all the limitations of that comparison. And so I, remember the old quote as well as the cliche that that's attributed to Mao, that women hold up half the sky, and found some very interesting reportage in the New York Times just not too very long ago, and I wanted to just read you this one quote, which is from a very famous Chinese newspaper that was established in the late 1800s, called Nubao. Nu, of course, is woman in Chinese, and so this newspaper goes back to the Qing dynasty in many ways. So I'm giving a 100-year perspective, and one of these recent studies said that. Of course, women, or this women's newspaper, Nubao, set up in the late 1800s, had 5 goals, and I'll list them: abolish foot binding, yes, educate girls, free marriage, and a job, and equality with men. And the conclusion is that in 2012, they said that women got the first 4, but not the 5th. So the 5th was equality with men. So they got the abolished foot binding, education, free marriage, a job, but no equality with men. And of course, in this country, we have debates about the wage discrepancy between men and women. So even in a country that I thought would have been associated with much greater parity than in India, it appears that process is a slow one. So that those notes led me to the despair part of my hope and despair title. So now I'll switch to the hope part. I think there are plenty of reasons for hope, actually, and most of them are forward-looking. So here I'm gonna rely on my strong suit, which is understanding the world of commerce and entrepreneurship and so on. The first is that in some of the newer age industries, and the primary exemplar is the software industry, that you see much more evidence of women being treated on parity with men on a variety of dimensions. So in places where a threshold level of education has been accomplished, it appears that market forces are sufficiently strong to induce people to treat all forms of talent equally or somewhat equally, at least compared to the counterfactual of how that talent would have been treated in so-called sunset industries. And that gives me hope, not just because it is, as a mathematician would say, an existence proof that you've seen it and therefore you can't rule it out by fiat, but because it is something that many other groups of people aspire to replicate in a country like India. That industry is held up as a beacon on a variety of dimensions, on good behavior of all sorts, on the idea of talent to rise from the bottom, on motivational issues, on ability to be globally competitive, on better corporate governance practices, on better stewardship of natural resources, on a variety of dimensions that we would all probably care about as citizens of the world. That industry is seen as a leading indicator of something. That's not to say that everybody's going to replicate it immediately, but as a concrete example, I'd say that corporate governance practices in India have always been quite pathetic. And it was only after the rise of the software industry and the practices that they engineered, in effect, that the rest of the corporate India and foreign investors in India had to sit up and take notice and copy it and disseminate it to other places. So there is some proof of dissemination of a good practice. And I'm making the jump from there, which is not yet empirically justified, but I hope will be, that some of the practices of treating talent will also disseminate. The meritocratic practices of treating talent, particularly correcting the gender imbalance, will also gravitate from there. In fact, I'm actually quite confident that it will happen, but it'll happen in industries that are more knowledge-centric first. Now, this doesn't speak, alas, to the vast majority of women in a place like India because, of course, the knowledge-intensive sectors are very, very tiny. By the way, as a calibrating mechanism, one should remember that, that if you think about the formal sector, formal economic sector in a country like India and the informal sector, just divide it in very elementary fashion into those two buckets. What percentage of economic activity in India would be formal today? Anybody want to take a guess? 20%. Anybody else? In the U.S., it's, it's probably 85, 90%. So 10% is black, illicit, illegal, whatever. Obviously, any measurement of illegal activity is definitionally imprecise because if you knew it, then it would be formal. So, but it's estimated to be 10% in the U.S. So 20%. Anybody else? Going once, going twice?
I think more like 40.
40%. Yeah. So the answer is 2%. 2% is about the right estimate, 2 to 3%. So in other words, 97% of what people do. And it's not all illegal. It's just outside of anybody's visibility. I don't mean to say 97% is illegal. It's just people pushing a cart, somebody selling things on the road. 97 to 98%. And therefore, nobody pays taxes, right? So there's no tax. There's no direct tax collection. Basically, there's no tax net. So when I say that, you should take my hopeful comment on the software industry and the modern industries with a huge pinch of salt because it's a very tiny portion. Nonetheless, it is something that people aspire to. So if you go, there's a very nice, celebrated writer, Gurcharan Das, who's written a lot of nice books on the rise of India. And he tells a telling anecdote about how, a mother in a village will always aspire for her child now to go into the software industry or something like that, as opposed to aspiring to go into the government and the implication is steal money through bribery and so on. So the first comment is that I am actually hopeful, despite that comment, with the rise of several islands of excellence in a otherwise sea of morass in many ways. And I see, my own role and as an academic, and in a very small way, our institute's role is to perpetuate good practice wherever one might have the option to do it, as I'm sure do you in your careers as educators. The second thing I'll say is something that we're seeing some small signs of now, and I think it goes back to an economic cause as well, which is that one of the reasons why good policy, I believe, has not disseminated in a place like India is that in general, talent has not migrated to public life. So if you, when I grew up in Bombay and Delhi and Bangalore, I think most upper middle class parents said, my son or my daughter is going to be stereotypically an engineer or a doctor or something like that, right? That was the career of choice. And you would only go into, I'm exaggerating here, but you would only go into public service if you were exceptionally public-spirited, I suppose, or came from a political family, or were predisposed to enriching yourself through some unsavory means, right? Otherwise, you just wouldn't do it. It was not a respectable thing to do. And this has a really insidious cost, which I think has been underappreciated, at least in the policy dialogue, the scholarly literature, which is if you don't have good people going into public life, it's sort of rubbish in and rubbish out. You don't get good policies enacted. You don't have the ability to do forward-looking things, etc. I think that is changing. And the reason it's changing is that for the first time, this past generation is the first generation that I think where, a relatively historically disadvantaged, historically not privileged person could rise up, have a successful career, accumulate a modest amount of resources, and feel free to go into public life. And public life I'm defining here as all sorts of civil society, nonprofits, start a NGO, go run for local elections. We don't have mayors, but run for local election, the municipal corporation, or even further, run for state assemblies and national parliament. And you know, I used to see 1 or 2 people a year, then I saw 5 or 10 people a year, and this time there are at least, you know, 150 to 200 people that I can think of across the national elections that have thrown in the towel and said, I'm going to run for election. I have no political background, but I am a, you know, I'm a geneticist, I'm a teacher, I'm a what have you, I'm going to do this. And I think that's fabulous, because for the first time, there is a corpus of talent gravitating into it for public-spirited reasons. Now, I'm an optimist and I do this, so I'm hoping that this translates into something. But it doesn't take a huge number to really affect significant change. I'm reminded of an Argentine student of mine who 15 years ago did an analysis of government in Argentina, which was very corrupt. Still is. It's even more of a disaster today than it was at that time. But he did a careful analysis to say, what would it take for him and a bunch of his buddies who were all educated and wanted to do good things in their home country in Argentina, what would it take for them to control parliament legitimately? In other words, if they ran for election in their local constituencies and they acted as a bloc, what would it take? And the answer was it would only take about 8 or 9% of seats in parliament to actually control the whole thing, because by acting as a bloc, their power would be quite amazingly strong to sway different decisions. And I'm reminded of that because I think what it says conceptually is that it's not going to take a lot for a concentrated mass of talent to. And now we have several fabulous examples of people doing this. I just met with this fellow Karthik, who's a professor at UCSD, San Diego, an economist who's giving a SAI seminar in the other building. He came by my office a few hours ago. And, you know, I'm quite sure he's going to end up in some sort of public policy role in India, doing something, designing education policy. And, you know, he spent his whole career thinking about this. So one imagines that he'd have something sensible to say, as opposed to a career bureaucrat who may not really know that much about best practices around the world. One hopes. So that's the positive side, I think. One is the existence of sectors of activity that are genuinely plugged into the world economy, that are operating in a world-class way, that have demonstrated excellence and accumulated a lot of wealth, and are acting as exemplars for the rest of the world. And the second reason for hope, both of which I actually deeply believe, is the beginnings of migration of talent into public life, as opposed to everybody going into the private sector to make a lot of money. It's very different. I remember as coming from India as a freshman to Princeton, being utterly shocked that people aspired to go to government. It just struck me as really bizarre. Anyway, so that's kind of what I wanted to say, which is I think when I look at as somebody trained as a mathematician or a formal social scientist, I look at the data. It's hard to see concrete evidence that influence has become, as we would say, normally distributed. That has been distributed across the population in a way that it ought to be, so that it's fair. And every human being has a right to say whatever he or she wants. That's just not the case. And despite many progressive attempts and the dissemination of some degree of political power has not translated into widespread influence. So that's the sad part. And the happy part I just told you. So I'm going to end on the happy part. So let me stop with that. Yeah. Thank you very much.